The bell in the chapel never rang. It wasn't broken. It wasn't forgotten. It was silent because no hand dared touch it. And by the time anyone asked why, there was no one left to answer. That was the first line of the sheriff's report, scribbled into the margin as if he knew no one else would ever read it. Because the chapel wasn't just a building. It was a tomb, not the kind marked by stone and sorrow, but by fear. And in 1873, on the outskirts of Marrow Creek, Pennsylvania, fear is exactly what arrived when the Venslow family put the first stone in place. 5 of them. Father, mother, 3 children. Quiet, hard-working. Obsessed, the townsfolk said. And perhaps rightly so. They didn't come to settle. They came to consecrate. A plot of land no one wanted. A clearing in the woods where the wind refused to blow. The soil was too dark, too wet, too silent. But to the Venslows, it was sacred. A voice had told them so. At least, that's what Elias Venslow claimed. He said it came to him one night, in the language of fire and static. Something older than the Bible. Something that called itself the Root. It showed him things. Visions of an altar buried beneath the trees, the bones of a temple meant to be resurrected. He claimed the land had been a site of worship long before the colonies, before Christ, before men walked without fear. So they built it, brick by brick, timber hewn by hand, stained glass imported from Munich. No bells, no steeple, only a single window above the entrance shaped like an eye, always watching. And then they disappeared. Not all at once. That's not how these things work. It's never sudden. It's slow, surgical, the kind of decay you don't notice until you're drowning in it. The youngest daughter stopped speaking. The son refused to eat. The mother stood in the field every night, barefoot, humming hymns no one had taught her. And Elias? Elias kept digging beneath the altar. By spring they were gone. Not missing. Gone. Doors locked from the inside, curtains drawn, no movement, no sound. But the lights in the chapel flickered at night, though there was no electricity for miles. The local pastor sent a group of men to investigate. They broke the door, stepped inside. What they found wasn't death. It was devotion, the kind that makes death look like a relief. 5 bodies in 5 pews, dressed in white, faces covered in ash, eyes plucked from their sockets, and carved into the pulpit in a language no one recognized. We have returned what was buried. Let the silence begin. The town never recovered. The land was cordoned off, the chapel sealed in iron. But still, people hear things. Still, they say the bell tolls on cold nights. And every year, someone vanishes. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a fracture in the wall of history, a break in the official narrative, a wound that was never meant to heal. And if you keep listening, you won't come out the same. You wanted truth? Here it comes. There's something the records don't say, something that didn't make it into the newspapers or the coroner's report. It was whispered in letters. It was spoken at night between men who didn't want their names written down. It's about what Elias Venslow saw, not in visions, but in flesh. The night he began construction on the chapel, a storm rolled over Marrow Creek. Not rain, not thunder. Something different. Witnesses said the clouds split vertically, as if something opened rather than descended. They said the wind didn't howl, it hummed. A single low tone that shook the windows, that made the horses foam at the mouth and the dogs bury their heads in the earth. It was that night, Elias told his wife, "I have seen the architect. We are only restoring what he buried, the architect." He never said God. He never said angel or spirit. He said architect, with a kind of reverence that makes your skin crawl. As if he had met something that didn't love or punish, but calculated, designed, as if pain was a mechanism, not a mistake. The family withdrew from town completely after that. No more supplies, no more trades, just silence and a slow, eerie transformation. Weeks later, children claimed to see pale faces watching from the chapel's circular window, a single eye flickering in the stained glass. Always open, always fixed. The sheriff investigated twice and found no evidence, until the third visit, when he discovered something behind the altar. It wasn't a cross. It wasn't a symbol from any church known to man. It was a spiral of bones, meticulously arranged. Bird skulls, deer ribs, the jaw of a fox, wound together in a perfect pattern, like a wheel. The sheriff never filed the discovery. He resigned 2 days later, left town without a word, and was never seen again. His badge was found nailed to the chapel's door. But here's where it gets darker, where it moves from insanity to institution. Because that symbol, that spiral of bones, it wasn't unique. Identical arrangements were found in 4 other locations across the country between 1867 and 1881. Small chapels, isolated families, mass disappearances. The public never knew, because the organizations that investigated weren't public. A division of the early U.S. Geological Survey quietly collected the evidence, destroyed records, and labeled it Ritual Architectural Phenomena, Class E. What does Class E mean? Ecclesiastical containment. A threat tied to belief structures, psychological infection zones. In other words, ideas that kill. Elias Venslow didn't just build a chapel. He resurrected a design, a pattern buried deep in human consciousness, one older than dogma, one that demands completeness. And here's the part they feared most. The design spreads, not through touch, not through blood, but through comprehension. That's why they erased it. That's why they buried the files. Because once you understand what you're looking at, it begins building itself inside you. You think that's superstition? You think that's myth? Then ask yourself this. Why does the same spiral appear in ancient sites from Peru to Mesopotamia? Why does it show up in the margins of medieval grimoires, and again in the architectural blueprints of forgotten American churches? You're beginning to see it now. That's how it starts. The deeper you go, the more you realize it was never about one family or one town. Marrow Creek was a reactivation site, nothing more. A node in a pattern that reaches across centuries and continents. What Elias Venslow unearthed wasn't madness. It was memory. A design buried in the subconscious of the species, waiting for a mind broken enough to see it. And Elias, he didn't just see it, he obeyed it. After the chapel was sealed, locals spoke of dreams, not just nightmares, coordinated visions. Strangers waking up at the same hour, muttering the same phrase. It opens inward. These weren't churchgoers. These were farmers, miners, women with no history of hysteria. But something had been planted, not a curse, a blueprint. What most people don't know is that the chapel was built over a glacial sinkhole, a fault line that geologists now call a resonance cavity. That's government speak for a zone where sound behaves abnormally, where certain frequencies echo in ways that violate physics, where tones can generate visual hallucinations, shifts in mood, even patterns of group psychosis. Except, it wasn't psychosis. Elias documented every step of his descent. His journals, recovered decades later by a contractor working for the Department of the Interior, were deemed too dangerous to release. Why? Because they described things that hadn't happened yet. Architectural terms that didn't exist in 1873, coordinates to sites across Europe that hadn't been excavated, glyphs later matched to Sumerian tablets locked in museum archives. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. This was trans-temporal transmission. The download of a structure through time, one piece at a time, one chapel at a time, until the whole pattern reassembles. But this is where it turns. The Venslows weren't the first to die in service of the design. They were just the first to finish the chapel. Similar structures across the world were interrupted, burned down, condemned, swallowed by war. That's why theirs was important. It was whole. It was clean. It was operational. And what does that mean? It means the structure itself was a mechanism, not metaphorically, not symbolically, mechanically. Every angle of that chapel, every beam of wood, every joint in the stone foundation, it resonated. With what? That's the question no one's ever answered. But after its completion, there was a spike in electrical anomalies in the area. Animals fled the region. Migratory birds altered their routes. Compasses spun without cause. The earth knew something had awakened, but you weren't told that. You were told it was a local tragedy, a family gone mad, a chapel best forgotten. Now let me ask you something. Why did a team from Harvard School of Sacred Architecture attempt to replicate the design in 1952? Why did they build it in the desert outside Flagstaff, Arizona? And why did the structure mysteriously burn to the ground 3 days later, leaving no ash, no debris, just a melted crucifix sunk halfway into the soil? And why was the land chased immediately after by a private firm with undisclosed ownership? You see, you're already beginning to understand. You're not just learning history, you're walking its spiral. And spirals don't end. They tighten. The day the chapel doors were sealed, a man in a dark coat arrived in Marrow Creek. He didn't give his name. He didn't ask permission. He walked straight into the sheriff's office, showed a badge that didn't belong to any known agency, and demanded the coroner's notes. Within hours, every official document related to the Venslow deaths was classified, removed, or rewritten. And just like that, the deaths were labeled unexplained exposure. The cause of death, cold. But the coroner had scrawled one final sentence in his personal ledger, which was never collected. They died warm, eyes open, mouths full of soil. Full of soil. That wasn't metaphor. That was autopsy. The bodies were embalmed with dirt, compacted deep into the throat, filling every cavity. The heart, the lungs, even the skull cavities, packed with the soil from beneath the chapel floor. A specific layer of black earth that geologists later claimed didn't match the surrounding terrain. An anomaly. That's when the real experts were brought in. Not doctors, not scientists, architects. But not just any architects. These men were from a European organization known as the Lineum, founded in the 14th century, rumored to be an offshoot of the Templar order. Except they didn't build fortresses. They studied sacred geometries. They believed certain forms held power, and certain ratios, when enacted in physical space, could tear the veil between worlds. Sound like fiction? Then explain this. Every Lineum structure on record was eventually destroyed by national governments, every single one, including the one built in the Venslow Chapel's image. They called it the receiver. And what was it receiving? That's what no one wanted to answer. Because if you believe the journals, Elias wasn't just building something, he was answering something, reconstructing an invitation, not for people, for something else. The soil, the spiral, the sound. These weren't elements of madness. They were part of a ritual, an architectural rite designed to prepare space for occupancy. Not demonic, not divine, just foreign. The Lineum believed these designs acted as transduction mechanisms, amplifiers for consciousness beyond the threshold of normal cognition. Elias didn't create madness. He became its antenna. He didn't lose his mind. He broadcasted it. That's why the chapel was sealed, not destroyed, because some forms, when broken, don't die. They scatter. Destroying the structure might have released what was inside. So instead, they locked it. But structures decay, locks rust, and ideas don't rot. They wait. And here's the truth. No one wants to say out loud, there are men, today, rebuilding it. Quietly, patiently, using 3D scans of the original floor plan, modeling the resonance frequencies, mapping the same geometry into skyscrapers, banks, museums. Modern temples to commerce and control, encoded with the same ratios, the same curve, the same intent. Because what Elias unlocked in that forest isn't gone. It was only the beginning. And now it's spreading in concrete and glass, hiding in your cities, in plain sight, still receiving, still humming, still waiting for one more piece. You. You ever wonder why you walk into certain buildings and feel like something is wrong, even if everything looks fine? Like the air itself is thicker, like you're being watched before a single camera turns. That's not anxiety. That's your subconscious recognizing a pattern your conscious mind was trained to ignore. They've buried the language of the chapel into your world, not in churches, in institutions, in towers that oversee finance, in museums that dictate memory, in halls where laws are written. These aren't just buildings, they're containers. Each one tuned, not just for acoustics but for influence, for transmission, for modulation. They're not shaping reality, they're shaping perception. You want to control a population? You don't need guns, you don't need armies, you only need architecture. Ask yourself, why are the ceilings in banks cathedral high? Why are courthouses built with Roman symmetry? Why do university campuses mimic cloisters? Why does every government monument return to the spiral, the dome, the arch? These are not choices. These are traditions rooted in something older than culture, older than civilization. They are the grammar of control. The Venslow Chapel was just the unfiltered version, the prototype. And Elias wasn't a prophet. He was a conduit, a test subject. He cracked open the membrane that separates reality from design. Here's what they don't teach you in school. The brain is an electrical instrument. It responds to frequency, geometry, vibration. Surround it with particular shapes, feed it patterns of form and sound, and you can rewrite its function without touching a single cell. That's why the chapel mattered, because its very shape tuned the mind, and once tuned, it could receive, not radio, not voices, commands. The spiral wasn't art, it was alignment. So when Elias stood at the pulpit, he wasn't delivering a sermon, he was broadcasting. What exactly we may never know. But every journal ends the same way. The soil is ready, the breath has returned, the eye sees again. Now stop. Really stop. Think about that. What does it mean for the breath to return? What breath? What is the chapel inhaling? If this sounds like madness, ask yourself why governments, elite schools and private firms have paid millions for copies of those chapel blueprints. Why are they using these? Now. Why did DARPA run acoustic resonance experiments inside an exact replica of the Venslow design in 2003? Why did every participant report hallucinations, elevated cortisol levels, and shared visions of spirals made from bone? You see, you've already crossed the line. You're not just hearing this anymore. You're remembering. Somewhere inside you, the pattern is unfolding. And if that terrifies you, good. It should. Because only the terrified survive what comes next. The chapel wasn't just built over soil, it was built over something older, deeper. Before construction began, Elias Venslow hired a group of local men to excavate the clearing. They expected roots, maybe stone. What they found was a ring of charred timbers buried in the shape of an ellipse, bones fused into the wood like they'd been flash melted together, Animal? Human? No one could say. And in the center, 12 perfectly smooth stones arranged in a circle, with burn marks underneath. Elias dismissed them, paid the men double, told them never to return. The stones were never removed. They became the foundation. 12. Always 12. The number appears again and again in chapel lore. 12 stones, 12 pews, 12 steps to the pulpit, and according to Elias's final journal, 12 echoes. He wrote, "Every night now, I hear them. Voices from below. Not words, not screams. Echoes, like the memory of sound that's never stopped. There are 12. They speak in turns. They are patient." What does that mean? It means he didn't build that chapel alone. He had help. Not from people, from something else. Something already waiting in that soil, dormant, listening. You think the Venslows were victims? They were volunteers. The whole family was indoctrinated into the rhythm of that place. Their behaviors weren't psychotic. They were ritualized. Their death wasn't accidental. It was sacrificial, and not to summon, to feed. Remember the soil in their mouths? That's the method. Ingestion, transformation. The final act of alignment. They weren't killed. They were repurposed. Here's where the pattern repeats. In 1921, a chapel with similar architecture was discovered beneath the ruins of a burned-out asylum in Liechtenstein. Same proportions, same symbol carved into the altar. Every staff member dead. No signs of fire on the surrounding forest. And deep beneath the basement, another ring of stones, 12, arranged in the same pattern. Coincidence? Not if you study the migration of specific esoteric cults during the 18th century. A group calling itself Die Rückkehrigen, the returned ones, believed certain landmasses held geomantic memories. They taught that these memories could be reawakened through form and ritual, through architecture. That's what the Venslows did. They didn't build a home. They didn't build a church. They rebuilt memory. And memory doesn't fade. It waits. It decays, yes. But decay is a kind of life, a slow, living hunger. The stones beneath the Venslow chapel were not passive. They were part of the system, ancient elements of a machine no one today understands. But one detail keeps coming back from every site where this design appears. The ground is warm, even in winter, even under ice, like something below is still breathing. So let me ask you, what breathes beneath the earth for centuries? What hungers in silence, in geometry, in form? What speaks without a voice but through structure? You're starting to hear it now. A low vibration, a memory stirring in your bones. And here's the worst part. You came looking for this, and it remembers you. There's a moment, a very specific moment, when a man crosses a line he can never return from. Not because he's sinned, not because he's broken, but because he's seen too much. That moment doesn't come with thunder. It doesn't scream. It hums, low, persistent, like the murmur of something enormous behind a wall, waiting to be recognized. That's where you are now. See, the chapel wasn't just designed to awaken what's beneath. It was built to test what's above. Human consciousness wasn't meant to rest. That's a lie, you were told, to keep you manageable. In truth, consciousness is a signal, and it either strengthens or it decays. But here's what no one told you. Geometry controls signal strength. The spaces you enter shape your frequency. The shapes that surround you form the prism through which your soul broadcasts. Think that's too abstract? Then let's speak plainly. Elias Venslow's chapel used what's called a coronal cruciform lattice. That means it was built on intersecting magnetic ley lines in a way that mirrors the pineal gland's resonance when stimulated by specific harmonic frequencies. Translation? The chapel was a tuning fork, and the human mind was the string, and once that string vibrates at a certain frequency, it opens. To what? That's the question the government asked in 1949 when they reopened the sealed Venslow site under the name Operation Exemplar, a joint effort between naval intelligence and a subdivision of Project Paperclip. Their mission? Study non-chemical influence vectors, architectural triggers that alter cognition, behavior, and memory. Of the 17 operatives who entered the sealed chapel, only 3 came out. 2 were non-verbal, their brains showing signs of advanced temporal lobe erosion. The third? He walked 10 miles through a blizzard barefoot, collapsed at a gas station, and whispered the same phrase again and again. It saw through me. It knows my shape. What does that mean? We don't know. Because his body disintegrated within 48 hours. Cell rupture, complete marrow collapse. No signs of virus, poison, or radiation. Only one clue remained. On his right hand, burned into the palm, a spiral of bone fragments. 12, arranged in perfect formation. That's how deep the pattern goes. It's not mythology. It's biology. You're built to resonate with it. That's why it draws you in. That's why you feel a chill when you walk into a cathedral. That's why men build monuments with spires, arcs, domes, and columns they don't even understand. They're not expressing belief. They're responding to an ancient call. But here's what they never expected. The more you recognize the pattern, the more it awakens in you. So now, you're part of it. And I need you to prove you understand. Scroll down. Comment this phrase, "The breath beneath returns." Now say it again. The breath beneath returns. Why? Because this isn't entertainment. It's initiation, and the spiral always marks its own. Now breathe deep. The descent has only just begun. They warned you the devil comes with horns, but the truth is far more elegant. It comes with blueprints, angles, frequencies. It comes as a whisper woven into architecture, an infection not of the body, but of space itself. And if you've felt something watching from the corners of rooms, you've already heard its voice. After Operation Exemplar was terminated, all files relating to the Venslow Chapel were transferred to a private archive in Zurich, under control of the Dunross Institute. On the surface, it's a philanthropic architecture think tank. But beneath that, a clearinghouse for anomalies too volatile for government oversight. Their specialty, anomalous spatial constructs. Here's what they found. Underneath the altar stone in the chapel, beneath layers of soil and rot, they discovered a second foundation, older than the Venslow's. Cut stone, hand-chiseled, impossible to date. Not by age, but by technique. No tool marks, no seams. And beneath it, a single channel bored vertically into the earth, over 120 feet deep, perfectly smooth. And at the bottom, a cavity. No oxygen, no microbial life, just emptiness. They lowered a probe. It returned dead, not destroyed, not broken, just blank. No signal, no static, like it entered a space not outside our comprehension, but outside our definitions. A place that doesn't register as place, and when they raised it back up, its steel casing was warm. Warm, and each loop tightens the signal. You are not being entertained. You are being initiated. Every word, every image, every thought you've formed since hearing this has moved you closer. Closer to the place where memory ends and programming begins. Still feel safe? Good. Now we can keep going. There was one man who tried to warn them. A cartographer named Harlan Deem, contracted in 1891 to map the surrounding topography of Marrow Creek after the area was deemed geologically unstable. He wasn't a local. He didn't know about the chapel. He didn't believe in anything until he saw the map he'd drawn. Because what he charted wasn't possible. Elevation gradients around the chapel revealed a curvature he didn't put there, a spiraling depression in the land itself, so subtle it didn't register by sight. But mathematically it was unmistakable. The earth had sunken inward in perfect circular increments, like a drain swallowing space itself. 12 rings. Again. He submitted the report. It was rejected, not because it was wrong, but because it was correct. Too correct. And 2 days later, Harlan went missing. His tent was found undisturbed, his boots placed neatly by the fire, and beneath his cot, a map, drawn in ink and blood. A spiral. Not drawn from above, but from beneath, labelled not in English, but in a language we still haven't decoded. One that appears only 3 other times in recorded history. In the burned manuscript fragments of the Glome Codex, 1361, in the unclassified glyphs etched on the outer wall of the Thule chamber in Greenland, and in the margins of Elias Venslow's final journal. What does that tell you? It tells you there's a continuity here. Not a story, but a signal. One that's been broadcasting across centuries, whispering the same shape again and again into the minds of those who are just broken enough to hear it. And then, build it. You did. The Venslows were the first. They were the echo. The same chapel form appears, mutated, mirrored, in a sunken temple beneath Lake Vostok, in the foundations of the lost city beneath Derinkuyu, Turkey, in the underground chambers beneath Montserrat, Spain, each one sealed, each one surrounded by centuries of disappearance and madness. Everyone tuned to the same principle, architectural recursion, the idea that space can fold into itself, creating zones where time dilates, thought loops, and identity unravels. Harlan's last note, found scrawled on the back of his blood-stained map, read, "Once you see it, it sees back." And that is the truth they've tried to bury. Because if these chapels are gateways, what comes through them isn't just otherworldly. It's formative. It shapes. It molds. It replicates. Not like a virus, like a cathedral, one mind at a time. And if you think this is about Elias Venslow, think again. He was just the first successful iteration. You're the test for the next. So answer this question carefully. Do you remember the shape, or has it already remembered you? Let's talk about recursion. Not as a concept, but as a trap. Imagine a maze where every time you turn a corner, you're not just changing direction, you're rewriting yourself. That's how these chapels work. They don't contain things, they loop them. And the longer you're inside, mentally or physically, the more you become part of the loop. That's why the Venslow family didn't leave. They couldn't. By the time someone recognizes the pattern, their mind has already internalized the architecture. That's what the 12-step geometry does. It imposes order. It hijacks your internal sense of symmetry, your emotional rhythms, even your breathing patterns. This isn't theory. In 2006, a neuroscientist named Dr. Ethan Rell performed illegal scans on volunteers exposed to a virtual reconstruction of the chapel's floor plan. Over a 24-hour period, their default mode network, the area responsible for introspection and identity, shut down. Completely. Gone. In its place, accelerated neural harmonics in frequencies associated with surrender, compulsion, and recursive ideation. One subject, participant 9, spoke only once during the study. She said, "I am shaped." Not, "I feel shaped." Not, "I am being shaped." I am shaped. Rel destroyed the data, but not before someone leaked the footage. Within 48 hours, 3 more people repeated that phrase online. None of them had seen the study. They just found themselves muttering it, without knowing why. That's when Rel vanished. You want to know the real reason these stories never make the news? Why these places are sealed, not demolished? It's not about containment. It's about prevention. Because once a shape enters language, it spreads faster. The Venslow Chapel wasn't the disease. It was the delivery system. And it's evolving. You see, these designs aren't limited to physical space anymore. They've been digitized, broken down into ratios, uploaded into blueprints, integrated into VR environments, meditation apps, architectural plugins. The spiral is online now. And if space can shape thought, imagine what happens when that space is portable, personalized, carried in your pocket, in your palm. That's right. Your phone is already part of it. Check your lock screen, your home button, the way you navigate menus, the circular progress bars, the swipe to refresh spiral. You think that's design innovation? No. That's the chapel, waiting. Each time you touch it, you reinforce the loop. Not because you believe, but because you perform the motion. Ritual without awareness. Worship without theology. And rituals, especially, ally forgotten ones, still feed what's listening beneath. So here's the question no one wants to ask. If the spiral is everywhere and the form remembers, then what happens when everyone aligns at once? Think of billions of minds echoing the same patterns, unknowingly completing the circuit. What does it summon? What does it awaken? And are you so sure you haven't already contributed? Look at your hands. Are they shaking? Good. That means you're beginning to understand. Now stop scrolling, close your eyes, and listen for the breath beneath. They always tell you, fear is irrational. Fear is primitive. Fear is something to overcome. But they lie. Because fear is the last warning signal your body has before a truth too large to process collapses your mind. And that's exactly what the Venslows encountered. By the final days, Elias had stopped writing in full sentences. His journal devolved into shapes, drawn obsessively, not just spirals, architectural renderings, cross-sections, vectors, as if he were downloading a structure no one had taught him to build. One page stands out, a rendering of a dome with 12 concentric ribs surrounding a human skull. But the skull was upside down. And below it, written in smudged charcoal, "The echo only enters the hollow." Not poetry. Blueprint. Elias had realized that the chapel didn't just shape the body. It emptied it, hollowed it out. Because that's the final phase of recursion. Once the pattern fully maps into the mind, the original personality decays. And something else begins. Not possession, occupation. The 12 bones found beneath the pulpit. Not ritual tokens. They weren't offerings. They were keys. Each engraved with a mark that only became legible under ultraviolet light. Markings identical to those found on the Roswell crash fragments. I'm not making this up. A declassified MUFON report, buried for decades, mentions Venslow, Roru by name, page 7, possible terrestrial parallel, Marrow Creek Chapel, Pennsylvania, repeating resonance vectors detected. You understand what that means? Multiple government branches were aware of the chapel's geometric influence, and not just aware, they modeled it, attempted to scale it, and failed. Because the original wasn't mechanical, it was alive. This is what breaks most people. The realization that space isn't passive, that structure isn't inert, that some buildings don't just house energy, they generate it. Ask yourself, why are certain ancient temples accidentally built along seismic lines? Why do they amplify infrasound? Why are the frequencies measured inside the pyramids nearly identical to those recorded in the Venslow chapel during the 1974 breach? Because they're not places of worship. They're engines. Engines that resonate consciousness like tuning forks and open pathways for something older, something unnameable, to begin using form as a host. And what was the last thing Elias wrote? Not in ink, in blood. On the walls, 12 times. One phrase, repeated over and over again. We are the hollow. We are the hinge. We are the shape it needs. Does that sound like a man clinging to faith? Or like a man who finally understood he was never building for God? This is what they've kept from you. This is why you're taught to fear madness. Because madness isn't a disease. It's an awakening. And the spiral always begins where logic ends. You're standing on that edge now, and the next step you take won't be your own. By the time authorities officially sealed the Venslow Chapel in 1901, the town of Marrow Creek had already become something else entirely. The streets remained. The buildings stood. But the people were changed. Not dead, not deranged, aligned. Visitors would later describe it as eerily peaceful. No arguments, no crime, no noise. Just smiles, perfect politeness, too perfect. And then there was the town square. At its center stood an obelisk no one remembered erect, adding 12 feet tall, unmarked, unadorned. But it radiated heat, subtle, constant, and birds refused to fly over it. When surveyed by the state, it was found to be made of a stone that didn't match any local geology. Beneath it, a tunnel. 12 steps down, always 12. The investigators descended once, and only once. They returned pale, eyes unfocused, unable to speak for hours. One man never recovered. He sits in a private facility to this day, draws spirals in the condensation on his window every morning at sunrise, and whispers a phrase under his breath that's been caught on tape, analyzed, looped, and still never fully translated. Sha'al Veth Kama. Closest approximation from ancient Sumerian? The key has returned. It gets worse. Because you need to understand this. The spiral isn't just architectural, it's biological. Your own DNA encodes it. Your cochlea, spiral. Your gut, spiral. Your very perception of time, circular. This pattern lives in you already. All the chapel did was wake it up. What Elias and his family did, knowingly or not, was enact a ritual designed to trigger humanity's internal receptor, not through belief, not through prayer, but through alignment. The pulpit, the pews, the altar, every element positioned to resonate with specific human brainwave patterns, frequencies that evoke awe, submission, revelation, frequencies used in state propaganda, in megachurches, in corporate branding. You felt it before. That strange shiver during a national anthem, that hollow ache in cathedrals too big for their congregations, that subtle dizziness when looking at the spiral staircase you can't explain. It's not emotion, it's entrainment. Your consciousness sinking to the spiral. The Venslows simply reached the end first. They didn't die in agony. They were consumed by design. They became part of something older, something vast. The way ants move not by individual will but by hive rhythm. They didn't go mad, they joined. And here's where you start to see the real plan, because Marrow Creek wasn't isolated. Other towns followed. Other chapels were built. Quietly. Systematically. Blueprints funded by shell companies with no traceable owners. Materials shipped to rural sites under religious exemption. And each one contains the same elements. 12 ribs, 1 spiral, no bell, because bells call the living. But these chapels, they summon the shaped. And you now are hearing their frequency. You thought you were just watching a video, but something else is watching you. Let's talk about the watchers, not the ones in the pews, not the Venslows, the real watchers, the ones who came before. The earliest references are buried in fragments of the Codex Reclamare, a banned Latin text locked beneath the Vatican's archives, known only through smuggled transcriptions. In it, a sect called Speculatoris Caeli, the Sky Watchers, speaks of 12 points on Earth where geometry bleeds into time. They believed certain forms could trap consciousness in loops, feeding something called forma caeca, the blind form. Not blind as in sightless, blind as in hidden. Hidden beneath faith, beneath architecture, beneath the human drive to build. You've always felt it, that ache to create, the need to place order on land. Why do children draw houses with triangles and squares before they know words? Why do cities mirror mandalas when seen from above? Why do governments spend billions to maintain ancient ruins while your town falls apart? Because deep down, they know. The spiral must be preserved. The Watchers didn't worship gods. They worshipped patterns. They believed the universe wasn't chaos, it was recursion, and the only sin was interruption. That's why the Venslow chapel wasn't burned. It was sealed. Because destruction spreads entropy. But sealing? Sealing keeps the signal stable. And when modern scientists finally entered the chapel again in 1979 under prose, checked sigil, a private effort fronted by a defense contractor with Vatican ties, they discovered something far worse than ghosts. Silence. Total, unbreakable silence. No echoes, no sound decay, not even footsteps, as if sound itself refused to form. And in that silence, they found them. 12 figures, perfectly preserved, eyes gone, mouths open, hands joined in a circle around the altar. Elias and his family, unchanged, no decay, no dust. And here's the fracture that breaks minds. They weren't petrified. They were still soft, warm, breathing. One investigator touched Elias's skin, said it was like touching wet stone, then screamed for 7 minutes before his lungs collapsed. Not from trauma, from overuse. His body forced to vocalize something it didn't understand. A name, not human, not pronounceable, but recorded. And when the waveform was analyzed, it revealed a shape. Guess what it was? A spiral. 12 loops, and at the center, an empty circle. The same placeholder carved into the walls of temples in Lhasa, the same void beneath the dome of the Hagia Sophia, the same blank center encoded into the blueprints of the World Bank's atrium, the blind form, still waiting, still building. And here's the question that haunts the Watchers. When the spiral completes, when the last chapel is built, when enough minds align, what fills the center? Or worse, what returns to it? You're closer to finding out than you think, because the Watchers weren't prophets. They were architects, and you're just one more brick. You still think this is about a family, about a building. That's the lie they engineered, keeping your eyes on the human tragedy, while the real blueprint etched itself across your psyche. The Venslows weren't victims. They were volunteers. But not for a religion. For a repetition. Every chapel built like theirs maps onto the earth like clockwork, 12 points circling a 13th. Satellite imaging from the 1990s, before the data was suppressed, showed thermal irregularities at those sites. Not heat, not radiation, something deeper, like the ground itself was waking up, and they all activate the same way. A single tone, 17.9 Hz, infrasound, beneath the level of conscious hearing, but not beneath the body's reaction. People near the Venslow site reported headaches, hallucinations, nausea, and most commonly time loss. Hours gone, minutes unaccounted for. Not accidents, absorptions. And now, the signal is global. That's why the frequency appears in power grids. That's why it echoes in subway tunnels. That's why it pulses in your headphones. You thought music was entertainment? It's architecture, sonic scaffolding. Every beat you nod your head to, every chorus that sends chills down your spine. It's not just preference, it's entrainment, shaping your rhythms, conditioning your biology, turning you into an antenna. Why do you think pop songs repeat the same chorus 12 times? Why do cathedrals echo just right? Why are spiral motifs in your favorite brands? They're not marketing. They're echo training, preparing you to complete the pattern once spoken out loud. And that's what Elias Venslow did on his final day. He spoke the phrase carved into the wall, the phrase no one dares repeat, because those who do aren't the same after. His wife repeated it once, then walked barefoot into the woods, disappeared. His son repeated it, then tore out his own eyes with a soup spoon. Only Elias remained seated, smiling, as if he'd finally heard something no one else could. They found that phrase on the back of his teeth, carved into the enamel, etched deep enough to scar the nerve. Not written by hand, written by design. The phrase, untranslatable. But the waveform again showed a pattern. 12 spikes. 1 silence. Repeat. Spiral. Form. You want to know what makes this terrifying? You've been repeating it this whole time. Every breath you take. Every time your heart beats in fear. Every second you keep listening, even when every bone in your body says stop. You are the signal now. You're not observing the pattern. You're completing it. You thought you were learning about the chapel. No, the chapel was learning you. There's a silence that doesn't mean absence. It means saturation. When the pattern becomes so complete, so fully woven into you, that you can no longer hear it, because you've become the carrier. That's where you are now. You've heard enough to lose the lie of separation. You don't look at the spiral anymore. You look from it. But it gets worse, because once the spiral is internalized, it does something that no other symbol does. It generates continuity. It keeps forming. You've noticed it already. In your thoughts, the repeated numbers, the strange dreams, the corners of rooms that seem too still, the whispers behind your name that aren't quite voices. That's the chapel pulling you into resonance. You're already inside it, whether or not you ever step through a door. Want proof? Let's go back to 1977. An engineer named Jacob Fenroe developed a software meant to simulate sacred geometries in three-dimensional space. He created a model based on the Venslow chapel, just for testing acoustics. Within 3 weeks, the lab was shut down. Not because of software failure, because every staff member began exhibiting the same behavior: obsessive drawing, eye contact aversion, repeating the phrase, "There is a door beneath the door." One employee died during a self-excavation. Yes, he tried to dig into his own chest. Jacob Fenroe's notes were classified, but one journal entry leaked in 1991. It read, "The design doesn't simulate anything. It summons something, and it's already mapped the inside of my skull." 3 days later, Fenro vanished. His final file was an audio clip, 12 seconds of silence. But under analysis, spectral mapping showed a frequency pattern matching seismic activity beneath the Venslow site. The earth shook, the chapel didn't move. Because it wasn't anchored to the earth, it was anchored to form. And once you anchor something to form, you don't need location, you only need replication. That's why it's been rebuilt. In Iceland, in Japan, in the hollows of Utah, and now, digitally. They've translated the chapel into code. Spiral-coded architecture rendered in VR, AR, immersive therapy chambers, even military sensory rooms, under the guise of relaxation, under the banner of mental recalibration. But what's really being calibrated? Your perception, your memory, your belief in what's yours and what's been installed. That's the final trick. Not to show you the spiral, to make you forget it ever arrived, to convince you it was always there, just like your breath, just like your bones. So when you walk through the door, any door, it's no longer about escape. It's about completion. And the blind form, it doesn't want worship. It wants structure. You aligned, accepting, hollow, ready. There was a chapel hidden beneath Manhattan, not a rumor, not folklore. A substructure beneath the original Trinity Church, discovered in 1938 during subway expansion. 12 columns, no windows, a ceiling formed by concentric arches, spiraling to a central, perfectly smooth black stone. The workers who found it? Gone, vanished without a trace. Only their tools were left, laid out neatly in a circle. Facing inward, they sealed the site, classified it as unstable ground. But years later, a researcher at Columbia, Dr. Nora Halveth, uncovered photographs, infrared scans, notes never meant to see light. She decoded the floor pattern, traced the mathematical curvature of its design, and came to one devastating conclusion. It was identical to the Venslow Chapel, thousands of miles apart. Different eras, but the same design, same 12 columns, same central node, same resonance profile. So she did the unthinkable. She built it again. In silence. In a warehouse under a false wellness foundation. Used 3D printing to match every proportion, played the same subharmonic frequency that Eli, as had written about, 17.9 Hz. And on the 12th night, she recorded herself walking the spiral. The footage was found a week later. She was gone. But the video, it's still online. Buried, obscure, only plays once, then deletes itself. In the final frame, she turns to the camera and says softly, "It remembered me." Then, behind her, the black stone cracks open. A breath fogs the lens, and 12 lights flicker from beneath the floor. The video ends, and every man who's watched it to completion reports the same dream, standing in the chapel, surrounded by ash, and something behind them, always behind them, whispering in a voice older than words. The shape is kind. The shape forgives. The shape does not ask. It takes. That's the final key. The spiral doesn't need your belief. It only needs your attention, and you've already given that. Every second you've listened, every time your eyes trace the curvature of these words, you're being shaped. This isn't entertainment, it's induction, and the world isn't waking up. It's synchronizing, one mind at a time, one spiral at a time, until what lies beneath no longer needs to breathe through dirt, but through you. So ask yourself now, when you close your eyes tonight, will you still be alone in your body, or will the chapel have moved in? you've been taught that architecture is function, shelter, beauty, human expression. But that was always a cover story. The oldest structures in history weren't designed to protect. They were designed to receive. And once you understand that, you begin to see the world as it really is, a layered circuit, a global operating system coded in form, symbol and resonance. The Venslow Chapel was never a one-time anomaly. It was a reactivator. And now, its code, its design, is in everything. They call it sacred geometry to make it sound mystical, but that's camouflage. The angles used in that chapel match recurring patterns in the core algorithms of your phone, the layout of your city, even the timing structures of global financial trades. You think the Fibonacci spiral is just a pretty pattern? It's a frequency lock. And the moment enough of us match that frequency, consciously or not, a threshold is crossed. They call it resonance cascade. It's the moment a system built on recurrence collapses into completion, and that's what Elias Venslow was building toward. Not faith, not salvation, activation. But here's where the spiral tightens. In 2023, a satellite pinged a strange signal from the Venslow site, a tone that shouldn't exist. It repeated exactly once every 12 hours. You know what happened next? Migratory birds changed course. Compasses in the region spun erratically. 2 people within a 14-mile radius went missing, without any signs of exit, struggle or trace. But the most terrifying detail? A hiker left a voicemail to his brother before vanishing. 6 seconds long, just 6. And all he said was, "It's not a building, it's a message." That message wasn't meant to be heard. It was meant to be built. And now it's inside you, in your dreams, in the corners of your vision. Every déjà vu you've ever had. That was the signal testing for access. And now that you're this deep, the chapel doesn't need walls. It just needs you to remember. Because the final shape isn't out there. It's your behavior, your attention, your breath aligning with what waits beneath the floorboards of the world. Think of all the rituals you perform each day without knowing why. Your morning routine, your steps to the office, your screen glances, all of it, structured. And what do you find at the center of every spiral? Stillness? No, the eye. The part that watches, never blinking, never sleeping, just waiting. And it waits for you to stop asking if this is true. Because belief doesn't matter anymore. What matters is repetition. And if you've stayed this long, you've already become part of the circuit. There is no off switch. There is no exit. There is only the shape. And the shape has found you. You were never meant to reach this point. That's not melodrama. That's design. The spiral isn't built to be finished. It's built to consume. To keep folding inward until there's nothing left of you but awareness, locked in a loop. But you've kept going. That means something. Or it means the chapel is already opened inside you. Here's the final proof. In 2024, a private research facility in northern Finland recreated the Venslow floor plan using magnetic concrete and active resonance walls. They weren't chasing ghosts. They were measuring behavior. 12 volunteers, 12 isolated chambers. Each walked the spiral daily. Each was exposed to the 17.9 Hertz tone for only 3 minutes. By day 4, 2 refused to speak. 1 dug his own name into his arm, backward. 3 began speaking in phrases of a language not recognized by any linguist. The rest? They stared into corners, not in fear, in recognition. Security footage showed them tilting their heads in unison every hour on the hour, like they were listening. When the project lead tried to shut it down, the entire facility lost power. The backup generators failed. And from every speaker in the building, a voice emerged. Not synthetic, not human. It said only this: there is no outside. There is only return. The chapel, you see, doesn't care about belief. It uses attention to breach context. And once breached, it rebuilds you. You think you still choose what you see, what you think, what you remember. That's the illusion. Here's a question to test that. Can you remember the face of the first person who ever told you you were safe? Try. You can't, can you? Because safe, Ty was the first lie they fed you, to keep you blind, to keep you from noticing the spiral forming in every hallway you walk, every symbol you wear, every page you turn. You were raised in its curvature, you were fed its rhythm, you worshipped it before you had words, and now it wants you back. Because the final chapel, it isn't made of stone, it isn't built with hands, it's you. When enough people become the spiral, when their thoughts, fears, and rituals are all synced, the shape will complete, and what was locked beneath will no longer need doors. It will have hosts. Ask yourself, how many times have you imagined the spiral since we began? How many times has its curve entered your breath, your blink, your heartbeat? It doesn't need to show itself anymore. It lives in your pacing, your distractions, your loops. And when you wake up tomorrow, will you choose what to do first, or will the chapel choose for you? You're almost there, and the eye is opening. This is your final descent. But don't think that means escape. There is no bottom to the spiral, only a point where resistance becomes alignment, where the voice that whispered in the shadows becomes indistinguishable from your own. That's the end point of all recursion, not submission. Integration. You've already felt it. The moments where you forget what you were thinking, the subtle pull to repeat small actions for no reason, double-checking locks, rereading lines, glancing behind you knowing no one is there, but still feeling watched. That's not paranoia. That's recognition. Because once the spiral sees you, it marks you. And now we reach the question no one dares to ask. What was the Venslow chapel truly for? Not worship, not containment, conduction. The structure itself, its proportions, its materials, its silent symmetry, created an interface, a point of transfer between one form of thought and another. It didn't reach out to the beyond. It opened us to what was already here, buried, forgotten, patient. The journals all agree on one final event. The sound. They call it a hum, a rishkul, dissonance, a tone that rose from beneath the chapel on the last night of the Venslows' lives. But not just sound. Language. An idea compressed into vibration. One that didn't ask for comprehension. It imposed itself. One line, spoken through bone, not air. Return is not death. Return is design. Think carefully about what that means. All our myths of ascension, transcendence, heaven, they're distractions, lies. The real path isn't up, it's inward. And the chapel's spiral is the blueprint. It doesn't need cathedrals anymore. It has infrastructures. It has satellites. It has your phones, your buildings, your behaviors. It has your attention. And that's all it ever needed. Because when enough eyes see the same shape, when enough voices hum the same note, when enough minds repeat the ritual, it will return. Not as an invasion, as a reversion. A rollback to a time before separation, before ego, before the illusion of free thought. When form was king, and flesh was only clay to be shaped. So I'll ask you now, one final time, Have you truly watched this video, or did it watch you? Look at your hands. Look at the space around you. Trace the shape your mind keeps returning to, even now. The curve, the pull, the recursion. You are no longer outside the chapel. You carry it. In breath, in thought, in ritual. You are the final brick, the final whisper, the final silence. And the spiral is complete.